This is Chapter 45 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 3 of Volume 3. Convinced as Elizabeth now was that Miss Bingley's dislike of her had originated in jealousy, she could not help feeling how very unwelcome her appearance at Pemberley must be to her, and was curious to know with how much civility on that lady's side the acquaintance would now be renewed. So Caroline Bingley is also at Pemberley. Elizabeth's now pretty sure that Caroline did not like her because she was jealous of her because Mr. Darcy likes Elizabeth. So she's a little concerned about how Caroline will treat her when Elizabeth goes to Pemberley. On reaching the house, they were shown through the hall into the saloon, where northern aspect rendered it delightful for summer. Its windows, opening to the ground, admitted a most refreshing view of the high, woody hills behind the house, and of the beautiful oaks and Spanish chestnuts which were scattered over the intermediate lawn. In this room they were received by Miss Darcy, who was sitting there with Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and the lady with whom she lived in London. Georgiana's reception of them was very civil, but attended with all that embarrassment which, though proceeding from shyness and the fear of doing wrong, would easily give to those who felt themselves inferior the belief of her being proud and reserved. Mrs. Gardiner and her niece, however, did her justice and pitied her. So Georgiana welcomes them, but if they didn't really know her, or if they felt very inferior to her, they may have construed Georgiana's behavior as being proud and snobbish, but Elizabeth's able to tell that it mostly stems from being shy and reserved. By Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley they were noticed only by a courtesy, and on their being seated a pause, awkward as such pauses must always be, succeeded for a few moments. It was first broken by Mrs. Annesley, a genteel, agreeable-looking woman, whose endeavour to introduce some kind of discourse proved her to be more truly well-bred than either of the others, and between her and Mrs. Gardiner, with occasional help from Elizabeth, the conversation was carried on. Miss Darcy looked as if she wished for courage enough to join in it, and sometimes did venture a short sentence when there was least danger of its being heard. Poor Georgiana is so painfully shy that she doesn't even feel comfortable talking to these people in her own home, and she only ventures to speak when she thinks that no one will really listen to her, no one will hear her. Elizabeth soon saw that she was herself closely watched by Miss Bingley, and that she could not speak a word, especially to Miss Darcy, without calling her attention. This observation would not have prevented her from trying to talk to the latter, had they not been seated at an inconvenient distance, but she was not sorry to be spared the necessity of saying much. Her own thoughts were employing her. She expected every moment that some of the gentlemen would enter the room. She wished, she feared, that the master of the house might be amongst them, and whether she wished or feared it most, she could scarcely determine. After sitting in this manner a quarter of an hour, without hearing Miss Bingley's voice, Elizabeth was roused by receiving from her a cold inquiry after the health of her family. She answered with equal indifference and brevity, and the other said no more. So Caroline is watching Elizabeth talk to Georgiana like a hawk. She's very much interested to see what passes between Elizabeth and Georgiana. Elizabeth's a little distracted because she's still wondering, will Mr. Darcy come in? She hopes it, she fears it, she doesn't know which one she feels more strongly. A roller coaster of emotions. And Caroline asks Elizabeth, how's your family? But she doesn't really care, so Elizabeth just answers very briefly. The next variation which the visit afforded was produced by the entrance of servants with cold meat, cake, and a variety of all the finest fruits in season. But this did not take place till after many a significant look and smile from Mrs. Annesley to Miss Darcy had been given, to remind her of her post. There was now employment for the whole party, though they could not all talk, they could all eat, and the beautiful pyramids of grapes, nectarines, and peaches soon collected them round the table. While thus engaged, Elizabeth had a fair opportunity of deciding whether she most feared or wished for the appearance of Mr. Darcy, by the feelings which prevailed on his entering the room, and then, though but a moment before she had believed her wishes to predominate, she began to regret that he came. So Elizabeth gets to figure out whether she's more nervous or happy for Mr. Darcy to come into the room, because he does come into the room, and she starts to regret that he came, because it's causing her some nervousness. He had been some time with Mr. Gardiner, who, with 2 or 3 other gentlemen from the house, was engaged by the river, and had left him only on learning that the ladies of the family intended a visit to Georgiana that morning. No sooner did he appear than Elizabeth wisely resolved to be perfectly easy and unembarrassed, a resolution the more necessary to be made, but perhaps not the more easily kept, because she saw that the suspicions of the whole party were awakened against them, and that there was scarcely an eye which did not watch his behaviour when he first came into the room. In no countenance was attentive curiosity so strongly marked as in Miss Bingley's, in spite of the smiles which overspread her face whenever she spoke to one of its objects. For jealousy had not yet made her desperate, and her attentions to Mr. Darcy were by no means over. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, exerted herself much more to talk, and Elizabeth saw that he was anxious for her sister and herself to get acquainted, and forwarded, as much as possible, every attempt at conversation on either side. Miss Bingley saw all this likewise, and in the imprudence of anger, took the first opportunity of saying, with sneering civility, "Pray, Miss Eliza, are not the Blankshire militia removed from Meryton? They must be a great loss to your family." Ouch. So Darcy comes in. Caroline's watching everything that happens. Elizabeth, when Darcy comes in, Elizabeth thinks to herself that she's going to be calm and collected and not worry, and she's going to be totally unembarrassed, but everyone's watching them. So it's not just Caroline, it's Georgiana, it's Mrs. Gardiner, it's Mrs. Annesley. It's all of these people are really observing how they interact, which is pretty nerve-wracking. But on the good side, Mr. Darcy tries to get Georgiana and Elizabeth to talk. Caroline's super jealous of that, but they are talking. And then Caroline has to throw in one of her little digs because she's not desperate, but she's getting to a point of desperation. And she says, "Oh, I heard the militia," where Wickham was, of course, in the regiment. "I heard the militia laugh. That must be so sad for your family."